Hello.
Good morning.
Morning.
How are you guys?
Pretty good. How about yourself?
Pretty good. It's nice and sunny here, even though it's like 20 degrees.
Oh, yeah.
The sun makes it though.
Yeah.
It was 60 degrees a couple of days ago, and
Now it's
it's
not.
been weird kind of coming up too. What's that?
Oh, nothing.
Whew.
Hello, Raj. How are you?
Yeah, hi, I'm fine.
Nice to see you.
Hello.
Hi. So, yeah, welcome to the meeting. We'll start with updates, I guess. Any personal updates you want to give? What you been up to in the last week?
Yeah, so I was just going through that open source sustainability project, and I looked through its last year's repositories, and I tried cloning and running it, checking it for myself. I made a dummy organization in my own account, but then I couldn't get any statistics for that because there aren't any repositories or contributions in that. So that is one of the things that is one of the concerns I raised in the Slack channel as well. Apart from that, I was checking how to all the data that the GitHub API gives, so that if we can add some extra data, we can obtain some more insights into our organization. And yeah, that's it for me.
Okay, yeah. So I see that Brian answered you in the Slack, and he explained, so the way the project worked last year is we developed the models, and then we there was a class afterwards where they built the sustainability auditing tool, and they don't. Actually, I asked Brian if he wanted to play around with some of the repo. I gave him admin privileges in some of the repos where we have data that we can actually pull. So we'll be working on that and getting that up and running. Really, though, at this point, I think the code for the sustainability auditing tool is really just like in the developmental stage still. I don't think it's ready to run. And
it's not production ready as such.
Right.
Yeah.
And the models were, we got them done. We oftentimes will, at the end of a previous year's GSOC, we'll wind it down. The people will build a model and they'll have it ready to go and they'll have everything done. And then things kind of, there's no, people don't automatically pick it up and use it. So it gets, there's a little bit of, a lag there with development. But that's, this year's project is really about kind of going over a lot of that and trying to improve it in different ways. So if you're writing a proposal for this, you would say, I want to focus on this part of it and improve it in these ways, and then get it to some point. And, we will do this, again and again until we get a really nice, So we'd have the models, then the sustainability tool, the models would plug into that, and then people would use the sustainability tool. Well, we'd have, we're going to try to get some data, limited data, to sort of test it out and see how it works. Yeah. Okay, yeah. So, if you have any more questions, put them in the GSOC channel in the Slack. We have some, I know we have a couple people who are interested in GSOC. And we've had activity. We were talking to another person, Vrushali, yesterday about a different project. So that's the place to go for that. Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that update. Questions? Amanda, how have you been?
I've been good. Cognition Futures was good as always. this has definitely been more of a downloading PDFs week than a reading PDFs week for me.
Yeah.
But I feel good about where the methods project is right now. I added some notes to that diagram that I made, which they're not in a completely shareable form yet, but it's related to that potential embodied intelligence submission. So focusing on the question of how mutually informed constraints can come into play in various disciplines.
Okay.
So yeah, that's all I have. Oh, and I found that lecture from Fuchs that I was talking about in the Slack channel. For the most part, it was like nothing too new, but it generated new thoughts for me that I have to go back to that notion and spell them out more. But I was thinking about why I think that there's a way to do cognitive neuroscience that's not really vulnerable to Fuchs's objection, like the anti-reductionism objection.
Right.
But I'm trying to think of why I think psychiatry might be different, and not just for like the pragmatic reasons of, oh, but like individuals are involved and the goal is to help people's material conditions. It's more than just that. I think it might be something to do with like, maybe it requires like a kind of an ontology of psychopathologies, and that's where you can't be like reductionist. Like maybe part of psychiatry, it has to be like outlining exactly what is depression, and that's a question that I think Fuchs's anti-reductionism objection definitely targets.
Yeah.
But I have to spell that out more.
Yeah. Well, that's great. Yeah. Yeah. So definitely, yeah. Let's keep going on this, on the bibliography and on the other things that we're doing here. Yeah, I think we need to make more. We need to start turning like the stuff that we've been doing and the discussions into like things that we can, submit, and so, and we've been stressing that. But I like the CI workshop because it'll give us an opportunity to lay some of this out, and there will be other opportunities as well over the course of the year. We might take another shot at NeuroMatch, which will be kind of interesting because you'll have people who do neuroimaging there. So we'll see how that goes. All right, yeah, thanks, Amanda. That's great.
I've also been thinking about what I would want to read next for the Cognition Futures reading group.
Great.
And
About that.
I haven't found anything I'm super excited about because I know that we'll like really do a deep dive and spend a lot of time with whatever book it is. So I have very high standards. But I was thinking something like I'd be okay reading something old, maybe like a classic cybernetics text. I was specifically interested in like the second order stuff. That's most relevant to the project. So maybe one of the classic books on second order cybernetics. The couple I found were very long though, so it would be like a year-long reading group. But yeah, I've been thinking about that. I don't have any nominations yet.
Yeah.
So my tentative proposal for this is actually going to be, I do want to do one like deep dive textbook. I think that's a nice thing to do, but I think also this is to be discussed more later, especially with the rest of the group. But like my immediate thoughts right now are, I think we got really lucky with some of the books that we read so far. Like Fuchs is a book I don't really regret at all spending the time we did on it. And I'm sure there's many other great books. But I think what I want to do is have a long deep dive textbook, but maybe break down a bit, especially if we're able to meet do an hour and a half meeting like we've been doing lately. And this is kind of contingent upon who's there and who wants to do what, to be honest. Because I don't want to push people away, or like I don't want like particularly you and Brian to some extent, and also Hussein has been pretty regular. Like I want to like keep you guys active. But all of that said, I would like to kind of have maybe break it down to be like 20% of the time to be on project management, maybe 40% of the time on the deep dive book, maybe 50. And then the like 30% of the time or around there to be on either like something that's a bit more liquid or liquidity in terms of passing through it. Like just maybe just literally going through our submissions to the form, or just really reading papers, like just taking 10 minutes or 15 minutes on a paper that complements the book or something else. Because I feel like that's particularly right now, I want to like, I'm trying to find the balance between that, because I don't know what's like. I think we're in a situation where we kind of just like step on the gas pedal of new stuff more, like really spread out the discovery and sort of getting our boundaries set. And I think that's just going to require a lot of stuff, unless we find a book that's exactly delineating, oh, here's all of all the methodologies we want to look at. And that, like, I don't think that's really what we want to do anyway. But I guess the point, to summarize it and be more concise, I'm thinking a lot about how to allocate time during those meetings and what's going to push things forward. So if we do find a deep dive book that is really long, I don't want that to be a deterrent either. It's just, I don't want it to be like 80% of our meetings and then 20% of the meeting is just like updates and other thoughts. Like, I think there needs to be space in the meeting for some more erring on the explore than the exploit side of things. But taking one deep dive exploit for sure, yeah. So anyway, you kind of get what I'm saying. Still waking up a bit. So yeah.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I have found a few like essay collections that I'd be into reading as part of the exploration. I found one, I think I shared it a while ago, that's on second order cybernetics, but like contemporary.
I'd like to see that. I've yet to fully prospect this book yet or not, but like this one is sort of promising.
Oh yeah.
This is like the Nunez edited one, so.
Oh yeah, Reclaiming Cognition.
It's like the turn of the century or something, and it's got a lot of people. It's got Andy Clark, Nunez, Walter Friedman, Paul Kaislik. There's a whole bunch of people in here.
I guess I'm also just not in, I mean, it'll take us a few weeks to finish Fuchs, but I'm not in a rush to pick a new one, because I think between like essay collections and just the methods project and focusing on, you know, deliverables, I think there's plenty of stuff we can
I think
do meetings.
That's a good point, in that as we're kind of wrapping up this sort of, I don't know, kind of, it feels like this sort of, we're like kind of wrapping up a chat like the Fuchs era and this sort of chapter of the methods project, which is sort of like, I don't know, chapter 0, like very, very preliminary project. We're kind of what we're going to be done, what will fit naturally next. I think will be continue to unironically emerge, and I think I agree with what you said. Totally.
Yeah, that's great. And I think definitely we should try to tie in some of like what we're doing with Fuchs or any of the readings with other things too. We've been doing some of that. I think it's, you know, it's useful because we have to eventually say, what is this? What is this for? Like, how did we put this into practice? And so, yeah.
Well, and that will dovetail into some of my. I don't know if I want to go there immediately next, but a lot of the lab. I've been part of one of my updates will be about like condition futures and also sort of like bigger lab management. Easy way to simply like grant writing language, but just sort of presentational language rather than have a bunch of conversations recently about this. And I'll give a more full update on that when we get there. But a lot's been happening in that way. I don't know. Anybody else who wants to give updates should go before I begin because I'll have a bunch of other things to say. So any other updates you want to share?
Not me. Well, actually, I will update. I will do the weekly project management course update, and then we can do Jesse's thing, and then we can move through the meeting. So we'll start with that then.
Yeah, that's good. Also, because I'm trying to finish something in Notion so I can show folks.
Yeah. Okay.
So I'm happy to have that for a few more minutes.
Yeah. So yeah, we've been meeting on some things this week, planning for different types of long-term planning and like got to make statements of vision and things like that for the different projects, because as we move through time, things get out of sync and you have to resync them. Like things will move around, so the projects will relate to each other in different ways. We shift our focus and other things happen, and sometimes we're doing things and we do so many, weeks go by and we do so many things, and they it's not so much that things go off into the ether, it's that we're kind of lose track of where we are and where we've been. Like a lot of I'll take cognition futures as an example. Every week we do something different, we have different conversations, and then we haven't really put out too many things like papers or presentations or posters, but when you get those and you get a collection of those, it's kind of like that serves as its own roadmap. So you have like all these things that are these artifacts that are out there that connect in different ways, and they'll tell you where to go next, maybe. Or, it's worth putting it on a website where you can list them. And it's the CV aspect of it is just listing them, but saying what the relevance of that is important too.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the impact. And the same goes for our GSOC projects. Like I mentioned that we typically we'll go through a summer, we'll get something produced, and then it gets to the good enough stage where you can submit it and it works. But then there's a lot more to do on it, and oftentimes that doesn't get picked up immediately. So there's a lot of we'll talk about it in the project management stuff, but it's like you don't have continuous development. It's just kind of like you get the effort, and then that's it for a while, and then maybe the next year we get more effort put into it, but that's just the way a lot of open source is, and a lot of projects for that matter. So with that, I'm going to go to the project management course for this week. So this week was the end of unit 2, and so so 4 lectures we've had 4 lectures in Unit 2. I talked about 7 and 8 last week. This week was 9 and 10. Lecture 9 was on more like community building, communicating with your community. So we're following from this book by Ben Cotton, Project Management for Open Source Projects. Project Management for Open Source Projects. Ben Cotton is a community manager at a large open source software initiative. And, he kind of lays out some of these things about program management and a lot of the soft skills that you might need to really kind of emphasize in building a community. So, you need to understand the nature of trust in your community. You need to be able to connect to and with the community. You need to build credibility and relationships with your members. So this is all like stuff that, it doesn't have anything to do with the project content. It's largely soft skills, but they're very important. It's that glue that keeps everything together. There are ways that he suggests that we do this. Keep regular tabs on your community's activities. So lurking is often a strategy that I employ in the Slack Jesse may do that as well, where you just go through the channels and you review them, and you don't necessarily participate in every conversation, but you see what other people are doing. And this is, can be looking at GitHub repos or discussion forums, or even community mentions in the press. You also need to have nice centralized onboarding materials. So you need to have a good, clear onboarding process. And we're always working on that here because our onboarding process is kind of, we have different onboarding processes, I think, for like GSOC, for our intern program, and then even just for people who want to join the lab. And, it's all different, but we don't typically treat it as different. Our onboarding is actually rather ad hoc, but, it makes sense for our scale. If we were onboarding 100 people a week, we'd have a much more standardized set of onboarding materials. So that's, that depends on your organization. And then finally, you need to provide regular updates to the community in the form of newsletters, blog posts, or other types of reports. And this goes again, so some people have developed open source onboarding programs that you can fork. So they're just come in a package and you can fork them. But, ours is actually pretty unique. So we might develop it and have it make it forkable, but, that's something that will take a lot of effort, I think. This is the community commitment curve. This is where, you have people come into an org and it's very, in a very limited fashion, they might just get onboarded. And then they start to become more and more involved. Their commitment increases over time. And, not everyone makes it up to the top where they say adopt a leadership role, but and you get a fair amount of attrition, as we know from the lab group. A lot of people, maybe stick to things down at the bottom here. So they're very casual about their involvement. Other people will take a leadership role, but that's not typical. And so you have to plan for that in your community. In your community building, you might plan that like maybe less than 5% of people will get up to this point where they're leading a project, which makes sense because you don't want to have a lot of projects, an infinite number of projects. You want to have a focused set of projects, but, just to remember that, you have some people who come to the org just to be like casual contributors, and some want to be more in-depth contributors and so forth. So that's an important thing to remember. Then I have this master plan that I developed for community structure, where you have things like incentives, sustainability, catalyzation, communication, innovation, and embedding. These are all features of a community or I guess pathways maybe is a better way to put it, through your community that allow you to interface with your main org or with people who want to participate. So, you have incentives, making it worth people's while, sustainability, which means keeping things going. Catalyzation means starting new initiatives or keeping the community relevant. Communication and innovation is the facilitation of open discussion, the encouragement of novel ideas like our discussion groups or our discussion forum. And then embedding, which is where you embed the community in everything you do. So in this group, it isn't so much of a distinction, but in some orgs, like in software development orgs, the community is actually separate from the core development team. So, your community is there. It's part of what you do, but you usually have a website for your project, and then you have like a tab that says community, which will bring people right into the community as they look at your project and they can get involved that way. But to have it kind of maybe also centered in some of the advertising you do or a lot of the materials that you make for distribution, like newsletters, you're constantly referring back to the community. So that's a way to do this. This is the master plan that shows how complex this process of community building is. Then, I went over some measurements. So we have different types of measurements, like you can look at GitHub statistics. You can build a community dashboard where you can evaluate statistics of usage and other types of involvement. These are bulk measurements. These are like just basically activity over time across many contributors. You can look at individual contributors and how they spend their time. So you can get a sense of what people are doing, their work habits, their enthusiasm for the project. Maybe these data show like that you're engaging in initiatives at certain times of the year or during certain times of the month. You can plan accordingly. You can look at things like measuring Slack contributions over time too. So you can do the same thing you did with GitHub here in Slack. And that can also tell you things about like how active your contributors are, when they're active, and so forth. Then you can actually do things like build fork trees in GitHub, where you can evaluate different forks of the project versus branches, and see how people are modifying your main project, your main trunk. And so this is the main trunk for this project, and there are all sorts of branches and forks that are being pushed back to the main, and you can evaluate some of the patterns over time here. And so you can also see how robust some of these forks are. Maybe they're forks that develop their own set of features, or they develop a life of their own. That's good to know, because you may not know that otherwise. GitHub actually tracks all of this, not just with respect to your own repo, but with all the forks as well. So you can actually look at that. It's kind of a nice tool, but it's another example of these metrics that we can use. Then we can build these static dashboards. This is something I built for DevoWorm. This is where contributors will get different badges for different categories of participation. So some people will maybe create a lecture, or they'll attend a meeting, or they'll do some coding, or they'll do a data analysis. They might write a publication or make an educational contribution. So there are all these contributions you can make and earn these badges. And then what you can do is put these badges together. This is from a different org, and you can put their, give their name, their badges, and it's basically like a dashboard where you have people, you can associate them with these different skills, and then you can do other things, like you can do a further data analysis with this. So this is this is a nice way to sort of show what skills people have, put them in different categories of contributor, and also, a way to, someone mentioned that this feeds into gamification as well, that you can gamify this so that, maybe people want to collect every badge. And it encourages people to do more contributions, or know where they stand in terms of their contributions. So I also actually covered briefly some of the things we did with open source sustainability. So this is an agent-based model. I don't need to explain that to people here what that is, but this is one example of what we did with this is Himanshu's project from last summer on agent-based models, where you set the parameters up and you can run the simulation, and you can actually see some of these interactions unfold over long periods of time. And then that can be plugged into the sustainability auditing tool. So I can come as a person who's running a community, building a community, and I want to sort of look at like some of these parameters like churn, or like different categories of contributor, or different types of issues. And I can, different models stress different measures. So I can just pick a model that has the measures I want to look at. And then I can run these simulations using, in the future, we don't have this capability worked out right now, using data from someone's own GitHub repository or their org, and then run it on those data. But you can also run it on your own data. Actually, it's a little bit, there's a caveat with GitHub data, is that GitHub is maybe a lot of times only part of the community. So GitHub will give you, if people are doing, there's a heavy emphasis on coding, on maybe docs or things that you just basically push to GitHub. If you're contributing but you're not doing that on GitHub, then it doesn't capture those contributions. So this is where the simulation comes in, just running the simulation on its own. because we can set it up so that we know kind of what people are doing. We have these measures that I showed you from different places. We have these evaluatory things, and then we can plug them into a model like this and see long term how we can make our community more sustainable, or what would happen if these were the different types of values for these things. So then, there's this issue of one-to-many interactions. So it's like if I have someone coming into a community, how do they fit into the existing social network or the network of contributors? And this at the left, there's an example of a network in the open source community. This is the OpenRPG Bug Report Interactions Network. So this is where you have people who are reporting to developers, 3 developers in this setting, and it forms a network that's sort of semi-directed towards the developers. So some people are issuing bug reports to certain developers, and they're showing those interactions. Now, if I'm a new contributor, I might just make a bug report. I might just interact with one person, or I might interact with multiple people if I'm doing something more advanced. When we have our meetings, we might plug in a new person to one of our discussion groups, which is like this network of skeptics here on the right. And the question is, how do they fit in most effectively? So that's a question, an open question, I think. Then I went over some network science stuff that I've done with these badges. You can build a network of contributors, and how you can build networks of people who have more than one badge in common, so you can get a sense of like the structure of your community, the connectivity of your community, who's connected to who, and so forth. And so that's lecture 9. Lecture 10 follows up on that a little bit. So I had a question about gamification, or a point about gamification someone made. So I went back and I wanted to kind of give a slide on that. There's gamification. There are a lot of tools for this, and in community building, it's really, I think, something that can be built upon. Gamification is basically turning something into like a game or some mode of interaction where people are trying to, it's almost like reinforcement learning. You're trying to, gain some sort of benefit out of it, or win, or gain more of something. Like with the badges, maybe people were working to gain more badges, or with a dashboard, where you put scores of people, like everyone has a score, and you make this public like monthly. People try to maximize their score, and the score is based on, how many pull requests they've made, or how many contributions to X they've made. There's all of this, and you can make this into a game, and it makes it a lot more fun. It does, there's a certain toxicity to sort of cutthroat competition, and that's something you want to avoid as well. So you want to make this like fun and maybe not as competitive as it would otherwise be. So, gamification focuses on goals, status, building fellowship, education, and rewards. So there are all these aspects of this, that you can build into your game world. And then successful gamification does 2 things. It taps into intrinsic motivation. It helps you become more skilled at your job. There's this intrinsic motivation to do something like that. But there's also extrinsic motivation, which is the actual rewards. They come maybe in points or badges or whatever. And so both of these things have to be designed for in the game. So it's really kind of an interesting way to do this kind of community building. I also mentioned this thing that I wrote a paper several years ago where I modeled open data sharing patterns, and looked at so the idea behind open data is that if you have a data set and you make it open, that's beneficial to the community, beneficial to you as well, because you can put data out there, you can make it transparent and reproducible and all of that. But the problem is there's a cost to it, and the cost is to the person creating the data. And so they have to format it, they have to create metadata. So the thing I was modeling here is I was using the iterative prisoner's dilemma to model different strategies that people might take in sharing data, if they maybe are selfish or if they're altruistic or whatever. And so this just shows, I mean, this is hard to interpret, I guess, at first glance, but basically there's a payoff for these different strategies. And, there's like random, cooperate, defect, and unforgiving. And so, it shows that these cooperate strategy is better than random. The defect is sometimes is better than cooperate. Sometimes cooperate is better than defect. Defect just means that you don't cooperate with the open sharing. I mean, the open data standard in the community. Random means that nobody cares. It's just kind of, at random. Unforgiving means no one wants to do it at all. And then, so defect is like when you're just like you're a defector from that strategy. So this just shows that like when you have people who sometimes don't do it, sometimes it pays off, sometimes it doesn't. But cooperate, of course, it also has its benefits. So it's just kind of an interesting thing I wanted to bring up in light of some of the community building stuff. Then I talked about technical debt. And I think this is a useful topic for us, but also for the class, for community building as a whole, but also for anyone who builds software or participates in open source. So technical debt is this idea of incurring a cost when you engage in a project, and the cost is due to like some you might try to finish a project quickly instead of paying attention to every detail. And in doing so, you've basically been able to complete your project and get it done on time, but you've ignored certain things that may come back to bite you later. They may accumulate as debt. They accumulate as debt automatically, but they may compound over time and make this, in 2 years, this might make the project untenable. So this is something that, it's a economic metaphor, but I think it works for some of these technical problems, and this works for academic problems as well. Like this is something I think in cognition futures we have to watch out for with respect to some of the things that we put out. When you put out a paper, it's somewhat already out of date because there's always literature coming out. You can't cite everything, but you want to. So, sometimes new papers come out that basically make your project or your artifact look dumb, but most of the time it doesn't. So there are all these this is technical debt in terms of academic work. In terms of code, I just mentioned earlier in the meeting that our GSOC projects, we get like a burst of development and then it drops off at the end of a GSOC project. Well, that's, you start to get technical debt introduced there because, there are different things that get updated that maybe need to be updated. We're running into this problem in some of our projects where, different versions of like Python and other toolboxes are out of date because people haven't turned their attention to it on a regular basis. So we get that kind of technical debt as well. And then new contributors come in and they say it doesn't work or, it couldn't be improved. And that's true. That's what happens when you don't have eyes on it 24/7, especially in a fast moving field like in machine learning or in some of these other areas where, the tools are changing all the time. So that's what technical debt. The idea here also is that, there's this question of who's responsible for dealing with issues that lead to technical debt and who's responsible for paying it down. And when you have a community, a lot of times there's a tendency to rely on the community to report bugs, but then by extension to fix a lot of this technical debt that gets generated. So if you create a project, you build a project, and you build it in a way that has a lot of sort of this debt embedded in it, the community is then expected to fill in the gaps, and that's not necessarily going to work. So here's some memes that show the concept. Instead of focusing on new features constantly, maybe you go back to maintenance. maintenance isn't going to drive the project forward in and of itself, but it needs to have a prominent feature, be prominently featured in your project. So this is, again, being tempted by the new feature, but being constrained by technical debt. And I gave some examples here of, if you build a bicycle with square tires, it's much harder to pedal than something like this. And that's kind of the idea. It makes your job harder, but it also reduces quality. It constrains you in terms of your quality going forward because you're optimizing for things, but not quality. You're optimizing for other things. And that's one of the keys to this. Just technical debt can be bad. It can make your job harder over time. It can lead to low morale and low quality. And then this is an example of maintenance that is not sexy, as they say, but it's definitely something that you can, that will improve your project and reduce your debt load. This is cleaning up the repo for the Food Not Food app. This is just some guy sitting there doing this debugging for 3 hours on YouTube, which is probably excruciating to watch the whole thing. But like the idea being that you're doing this in public, you're kind of sorting these issues out, and people can reference this and fix them. So, this is leading by example, organizing, spending time organizing things, getting things in line. And that's a thing you want to do to keep this debt under control. So then I talked about, how do you reduce this community friction, which is, of course, the source of a lot of this technical debt. If you can reduce that friction in the community, you can reduce technical debt, but you can also improve the amount of participation you have in the community. So, and you have less leakiness in that pipeline. You have more people wanting to engage with things. So how do you do that? You want to do that from the start. And I say start here because it's really about from onboarding forward. So, this starts at onboarding, but really there are a lot of things that you can do from the beginning, but also, further along in the project to facilitate this. One is knowing how to ask your community for help for specific things that you want to solve. So this is something from the NeuroMatch Mastodon. This is a skill we rarely teach, but is crucial in my opinion, is how to effectively ask for help from online software communities. Any best practices, guides to get started, and go beyond this is some code, can you fix it? So you don't want to really ask that. You don't want to say, can you just fix this? Because that's not going to elicit much of a response. What you want to have is a formal procedure for posing questions and getting people to give, the best answers they can. And then, you want people to engage in the thing and not feel like you're shoving it off on them. The R community, which R is a statistical software, they have something called an R cookbook, and they have an entry in there that is like their best practices for submitting questions to Stack Overflow or elsewhere in the community. And having this available, I think, for people is very useful because, it helps you with this process and it makes it optimized for the best answers and the best sort of facilitation. But the other thing I focused on is this idea of a guidance tree. So this is Stephen Larson from the Open Worm Foundation. I worked on the community committee with him in 2016, and we worked on this idea. This was a sketch at the time of something called a guidance tree, which is when you take people in during the onboarding process and you find out what they're really interested in of all the things in your work, and you want to put them in buckets where they can sort of find a place to start doing something substantial. So if they're maybe good at programming or they're good at literature review, or there are all sorts of things in your org, depending on what your org does, that you can put them into and get them started. So this is a sketch of this tree. It's a binary decision tree where you find the key sort of division points, and then you have them answer questions and they find their place eventually. You want to make it logical, so the flow is logical from top to bottom, and you want to make it you want to get from the basic dichotomy in your community to the most specific. That's what you want to do. So I implemented this in the Rockwire community. This is embedded in a website, of course, as I mentioned before, where you have all the other resources, but you have this guidance tree in there so they can like find a spot for themselves, but they can also see they're also kind of in the org, and they're in the, the community is connected and the guidance tree is connected to the larger org. In any case, this is the top of this tree. The distinction here was, would you like to make a coding or programming contribution or building contribution, which is documentation, maintenance, design, or discussion. That's our basic dichotomy here. So pick one of the two. In this case, we pick coding, where we can either do open source coding ourselves or platform adoption, which is what an org would do if they wanted to adopt the platform. So there's a dichotomy there, and this leads to different resources. Platform adoption leads to some like IP resources and other things. Open source coding leads down another path towards, personal education and like the GitHub repo and all that. This is building, which is like technical review and ideation. This is like bug reporting, doc creation, discussion groups, and so forth. And then if you go down to this one, this is where you get down to like in the open source coding path. You click that, you go down a couple levels, and this is kind of where it takes you at the bottom. You have to go through, I want to make sure that you've consulted our wiki, our docs, our tutorials, and our API resources. If you've done all that and you're familiar with them, then you can get started in the GitHub repository, or you can go to develop other developer resources, which are, people want to do different things. So you want to give them that option. But that's basically the way it's structured. And then finally, this is from the documentation path. This gives you like two options for creating docs. You can either create a set of demos or tutorials or wiki documents. And so it gives you the option to do these different things. So then the rest of it was just reviewing the unit. I'm not going to get into that, but I think that's a good overview of what we did this week. Next week we do Unit 3, so that's good. Hello, Vrushali. How are you? Okay, so Jesse had a question. I've spent a lot of time this week on making a generalizable onboarding map. More about this later. Very good. Did we have any questions on the project management stuff?
Well, I suppose it's less of a question and more, I'm particularly, I don't have anything in a finalized state right now, but I would like to, I would like to run through some things with you, Bradley, about, I saw the sort of decision tree that that was something that I was also, I basically want to have something like that for folks, because I feel like what we can do, and this is basically dovetailing that conversation and some a lot of new stuff, is basically, I think some of the stuff I really would like to give people in the sense is, and also borrowing a little bit from like the work we're doing on plot twisters about this stuff, is basically, I think some of the, having some really clear answers to big questions around expectations and timeframes, I think is something that I would like to update. And I think having a clear onboarding map, almost, I don't want to trivialize it to doing sort of like the video game quests tutorial type of thing.
Yeah.
But basically, for most people, there's in our particular context, we have people that we kind of have revolving seasons in the lab. We have Google Summer of Code season. We have new faces here right now for that reason. Generally, we have the internship on like major start of the semester stuff for the internship program. There's sort of the ethics season, which tends to be associated with New York Celebration of Women in Computing, which is in the start of the year. We have the Neuromatch summer season. You know, we have these different seasons, and that's sort of a reality that's going to dictate a lot of things for us. It won't. I don't think we're going to get to a place that's crisp and clean. Like in academia, it's much like in undergrad and generally, a lot of as a typical student, as a typical student, you kind of, you're kind of, okay, well, this semester for the next 16 weeks, I'm going to be doing this project. And we basically don't enforce any temporal deadlines on people outside of ones dictated by external sources like Google Summer of Code or submission deadlines. And I'm not sure if I don't know, to Bradley's point earlier, like it depends on the size and the scope of the organization and what they're doing. I do think offering people a little more structure that way may be good. Or at least maybe like a designated, I don't want to say trial period, but sort of like the tutorial demo version of the video game, if you will, where it's like, okay, for people who don't have a lot of, if you're coming in for a specific project, you're coming for Google Summer of Code, those are already, the scope, the timeline, the involvement is explicitly stated from the start. And that's great. And that's a very established process that's managed by other things. What are versions of that we can do for interns? People. A lot of times we have people passing through. Oh, I saw this cool thing, or I saw a blog post and that was really cool, or I saw this Twitter thing that you guys do. I read your old paper, and we get this sort of nondescript things. So I think having a bit more structure about that, and I think having also the other side of the coin in terms of all this grant language that I'm talking about, and all of that stuff is related to creating interpretable high-level language for those just outside the lab or joining the lab. And then also, you may recall our map that I made last summer, which had like kind of the big 5 research banners and some other things around them. And I'm going to go over that a little bit too. I think updating that will be good too. And the last thing I'll say about this specific conversation is absolutely about like every quarter or 2 or 3, you kind of have to sync all of your stuff. Like it's just not. There's no way particularly in the amount of like actual idea work and research and project creep, not in a negative way, but project expanse that we naturally have. Like there's, I don't think there's not a magic bullet about this. It's just sort of like you kind of have to, eventually you have to make your bed and do it up and like change it all over, and like you just have to do it at some point. And I feel like there's no real way around it. So, yeah. Oh, I'm on camera now. Anyway, that's a lot of different directions that can go in. But I'll give the mic back to you or Bradley right now.
Okay. We have
Also,
any other comments or questions? If not, I think Jesse can give his update on, I don't know what the stuff that we were talking about.
Apologies, because I have like a slightly sore throat, and it's making my tongue like it's like I have something in my mouth, but I don't.
Okay.
I feel like I'm like like part lisp, part slur, and part just like I can't move my mouth normally. So
Yeah.
I feel fine. It's just like throat agitation. So if you see me like make a lot of weird mouth gestures, that's why. Okay, so we didn't. I guess for like a general, like what have I been up to in the most general sense this week? had a lot of conversations with Bradley and other folks in the lab too about if nobody knows me, hi, I'm Jesse. I'm lab manager, and I do a bunch of other stuff here. I'm involved in some like cognition futures and society ethics sector kind of projects I helped establish, and I've been in the lab for a couple of years. So, hello. As lab admin, one of my hats that I wear is a very neuromatch hat related comment. One of the things that's been on my mind is how do we talk about cognition futures, and also how do we talk about everything I just said about the lab and onboarding and other things like that. So I think what I'll do is, let's see if I can do it this way. Obviously I'm between different devices here. I'll just turn this one off. All right. Oops.
There we go.
All right, great. One's got to be muted, otherwise you're in trouble. All right, so let's go start from what has been and try to go from there. Which actually might be easy to do on this computer. 1 second. Some of you may have seen, may know and love or not love this particular
Yes.
map, if you will. This is basically made. This is the original one from about, I don't know, 10 to 9 months ago.
Yeah.
And I don't know, we've kind of tried to separate it out into these big banners that we have going on, because they're obviously everything's interrelated, but there's sort of these different arenas. You can kind of see big banners on top, some of the concepts below. The purple at the time was sort of deliverables or like outputs that we've done. And then you've had, there's been debate about order of these things. You've had, these are events we've contributed at, roughly aligned with the banners, but not necessarily. And then external partners and collaborators. I think that was fairly reasonable at the time. I think things have since changed a little bit. And I haven't finished the map yet, so I'll show a work in progress of that. But I think it's good to have a little bit of how it started, how it's going, kind of a deal. You know, those things.
Yeah.
Let me change this off. So that's sort of part one. Where I'm at with this here, at a quite a high level, is let me share this window. I think this is working. Oops. Nope. Well, there we go. Okay. All right, let me move this so I can see this better. So this is sort of on top. And I think where we're going with this is actually, and feel free, this is not finalized. This is more just, this is incomplete to shift it around a bunch of stuff. This isn't, don't worry too much about the organization of this. Actually, what I want to do, well, first I'll start by saying, I think Bradley and I have talked a little bit this week about kind of having organizational brains of phenotypes, cognition futures, and Dev AI kind of all under, that's where a lot of the inspired by MIT's quest for intelligence stuff overlaps from this. If you haven't heard me in the last 2 weeks or last week, I'm back from DC. I was at AAAI, Association for Advancement of Artificial Intelligence. It was a nice event, a little bit more intense, like it's heavy software development more than what I do necessarily. Keynote Josh Tenenbaum, who's a major computational cognitive scientist figure based in MIT, and I was impressed by his diplomacy. And what I mean by that in a very short amount of time is I find Josh to be someone who really cares about what I think is sort of a take on the cognitive science project that I value in terms of developmental aspects, in terms of developmental psychology, in terms of how the innate structures change and the relationship between environment and the agent change and develop over time. He's very cognizant and understanding of the process over time of the changing capacities. Like the intelligence or cognitive level isn't a fixed state. And I like his take on that. And I feel like he's in a situation where he gets this sort of buffer from MIT as the rigorous technical engineering school. And he worked primarily in probabilistic programming, and that's his technical tool for it. But I feel like he's doing, particularly with how he talked about the Quest, for those who don't know what that is, what is it really? It's nothing. It's basically just big fancy language. Like there's not any like, oh wow, MIT has the key to the magical portal, and they're going to use this Quest to insert fictional universe of your choice. But basically, it's a big place you can go to see all the cool stuff they're doing, and they break it down to being in these missions, and this like language around missions of we'll bring a team of scientists, engineers, supposed to answer questions, fundamental nature, and they have these different missions broken down into what they're doing. And I feel like I'm not trying to say these three missions about developmental intelligent minds, embodied intelligence, and bringing better hardware intelligence map onto these by any means. But I think there's sort of a similar, these three together, and we haven't really fleshed out what Dev AI is, or developmental AI is, to folks who haven't been in the lab necessarily. But I think that may be a more accurate than having it being DevaWorm itself. Because DevaWorm is obviously our sister group, and a lot of the Google Summer Code overlap is in that way too, and people kind of go back and forth between the groups, and that's great. But I think for our lab specifically, I think Dev AI is kind of the stuff I put in here was Dev AI critical periods before, and now it's like Dev AI is sort of critical periods, maybe the brain developmental biology and brain organized project, which I don't really know. I actually find something really cool about that, put that in Slack for the brain organoid development stuff. But kind of this, I think conveying to folks that we have sort of this interplay between these three in particular. Obviously, these aren't far away, but like particularly there's a certain synergy between these arenas that is a major thrust, as people say. It's a weird term to me, but that kind of reminds me of this structure. And this, if you're seeing for this for the first time, it might seem kind of, oh, cool, yeah. But what are these? What is these little icons? Or what is this blurbs about? It's really doesn't say anything. It's just it's 4 sentences describing a really broad research agenda that a couple of their major scientists are working around. That's what it is. And I'm not saying we have to make these sentences. It's much more, how do we frame this? And so to kind of come back to a little more concrete things for us, I spent some time this week sorting this out and thinking about our onboarding issues in general, and how we can improve them. And what I would like to do is flesh out this map, which to me will kind of be, I would also like to basically get to a place, I've been, as you can kind of see, I think you can kind of see, I was looking for like presentation software ideas, and this is Canva, and I've used a bunch of other things, but currently this is in Canva right now. And what I would like to kind of get is like one layer of the map that's kind of just big ideas and concepts, and kind of what the original was, where it was sort of broken down into sort of simple categories. And I think that's a nice at a glance thing. An onboarding version of this map might be, we have these 5 banners, we have some concepts, but then actually more detail about the deliverables, what we're doing in terms of, oh, for more about this, why don't you see our presentation at NeuroMatch, our presentation at CSV, our presentation at WeRobot, our presentation at all the places we've done. Because like this, what's really hard to convey here is how much we actually have done here. And I haven't fully updated this Notion space yet, but I will show this as I go back here. I've updated the database too to make this a little bit more explicit. I've broken it down into project management stuff. We have our meeting notes, task board, and outputs, which I'm going to reference next. And then I'll update the title later, but you can kind of see where I'm going with this. But I'll go right into, like, we have an incomplete, as of a couple months ago, take on outputs, but we have all these things that we've done. We have accepted papers, we have preprints, we have published, and a lot of these things are just on Google Scholar and not really listed out. But what I'm basically getting it to the point of, if we can get basically back to, if we can go to this map and have it more onboarding or very clear sense of, oh, I'm joining, for example, let's talk about cognition futures. Oh yeah, I think I might want to do some stuff with the lab. I'm kind of interested in cognition futures. I see you're interested in these topics. This isn't a great example because this isn't happening here, but what could be here is the methods project. And then you kind of see, oh, well, you can see the events, like you basically want to convey, if you join us and work with us, you can present your work at Cognitive Science Society, at NeuroMatch, at Embodied Intelligence Workshops. Like you can take the work you're doing and have an experience, an output at this event, and then see the events, and then you can see underneath them, oh, well, in 2021, we had a discussion, we had a presentation at Embodied Intelligence Workshop that was blank. I did one about like cognition papers or like frontier mapping at that time, I think. So kind of just having this sort of line down here, and then maybe like finalizing it for onboarding would be almost like offering a kind of something akin to it, like a quest tracking system, or a quest, like here's your initial quest. And for interns, it'll be like, I think like we typically steer toward like the blog post or literature review, or basically getting some people familiar with reading the literature in this area, talking about it and telling us what they take from it. Like that's kind of for the, for certain, I think there's work to be done also in terms of like breaking down what are the tiers of people we have coming through, because sometimes we have like people who have their masters, or who are postdocs, or who are PhD level, who are they kind of know what they want to do and they're going to do it, and it's just giving them the space to do it and saying, okay, let's work here. And that's very different from undergraduates or people who aren't based in people who are kind of newer to research or early career research in general. And I feel like a great thing about the lab is that we don't turn any of those people away. There's usually pretty strong barriers to access of those things. And I feel like I've done a bunch of like DEI and personal statements lately about why do you care about diversity and inclusion when you're applying to stuff? And it's like, well, I'm someone who's a non-traditional student. I went back to school. I didn't have parents that went to four-year colleges. I know aspects of what it's like to be excluded from conversations or not really know how to get on ramps. So that all that stuff matters to me personally. But in the lab itself, we're really good at creating those on ramps. And I think Bradley's particularly I won't speak for Bradley, but I will assume or generously suggest that it's a great thing to be open about that in a sort of we're not bound by certain deadlines and requirements and academic structure and hoopla. And that's a great thing, and it may be a helpful thing for advancing academia or education. But also in a strategic way, so much of what we're doing is very hard to have funded in general. Like it's not really some of the work we're doing is as I think I was quoted, I don't remember saying it, but like ridiculously interdisciplinary in the sense of it really cuts at certain if you say, oh, I want to study cancer or I want to do machine learning, people know what that means. If you study some of the stuff we're doing very seriously and doing work in, it's harder to do. So there's a lot of reasons why things are the way they are in the lab. And I don't want to change that ever, really. And I'll defer to Bradley about more explanation of that. But suffice to say, I think I spent a lot of time thinking, how do we, what's the next evolution of all of these things? Where from onboarding to our fancy grant writing, grant application terminology, to presenting it a certain way online, to how we talk about it internally. So that's sort of my opening volley of administrative and external communications ideas. And before I say any more, I'll open discussion about that.
Very good, thank you. Yeah, I don't know if anyone had anything to say about that. Any questions? Comments? Well, yeah, I thought it was great, and there are a lot of points that you brought up that, like, I took some notes on this. I think the lab outputs is good. We talk about artifacts, but we don't necessarily show what those, like, you can make like I said before, you can make a list of things and put them on like in a CV style thing where you just make a list of things chronologically, but that doesn't tell people kind of how that fits into the larger scheme, larger strategy.
Yeah, and it's quite. Let me share this again. It's quite. Like I really think this is important, like, to take away from, in that if you look here, like a lot of academic or research related websites will kind of look at a few of our publications. Like let's do another example. What's our lab website? Here we go. Like this is a lab of someone I respect a lot at UCSD. And they don't have a whole lot of stuff here. They have news, which have for us have been like, I used to do that on the old GitHub page. I would basically have this. You kind of have your boilerplate statement. We are blank, we are blank, we are blank. You have your people, right? And your research is sort of like, again, this is what, less than 15 sentences of like framing, and you have a list of papers in your lab as outputted, courses that professor fans taught, outreach, which is cool. Like I like this. And then for prospective lab matter, like this is what people like. For people who don't know, like academic websites are strange because it's not really. It's not. You can't really capture everything that's going on. Like she's like, I don't think we should. And as much as I was, well, the last thing I'll show, continuing from this, I suppose, will be. Actually, how can I do this easily? Okay, how wacky is this to see? Nope, that's not what I wanted to do. I'm gonna try. Huh. I have 2 of these open, but they're not gonna show. Oh, this might work. Okay. Right, you can just see Notion now, I think. Let's move this out here. I'll move this a little bit bigger. Great. So what an adjacent thing that I'm developing along all this, or I don't know if developing is really the best word, but sorting out to steer us a little bit more. Is setting up a timeline or sort of a project view from our tasks and what's going on here. And I think this will be, I'm kind of learning how Notion's doing this sort of, oh, we have dependencies now, and how we're talking about, like, you can tie these things to that in a sort of semi-visual Gantt chartish way. But I put kind of quickly where we are with stuff. I'm not sure yet how to do these bigger chunks of time things, and if I wanted them, like, we kind of are, we're in a Christian Futures Reading Group, we're in a very particular era of, we're going to be closing a major chapter soon of a book, and also, like, metaphorically of a chapter, the Fuchs book. We have this big Google Summer of Code period. I kind of like the quarterly view better in some ways, because it's much more zoomed out. But you can kind of see these things. This is initially complete, and I want to actually spend a little bit of time adding to this if you want to right now, because this is sort of like everything's on the table right now. We have the NYCWiC stuff, which is going to be, we're basically at the tail end of that. I have to finish some of the abstract work, and then it's just going to be until for the next until April, we're going to have this chunk of time where we're finishing out the flash talks. That's what that's going to be. Bradley just dropped some abstracts for Alife, and I wanted to know when those were due, because I couldn't tell.
March, at the beginning of March, like March 1st, March 3rd. I think March 3rd is their deadline, but they'll extend it like by a week. Almost always do. So
we'll do that for now, I guess.
So that's actually 2 things. That's a paper, like a paper for the main track, which is this critical periods paper. And then there's this other paper on the GSOC stuff from last summer, which is the open source sustainability. And that's for a workshop. But they're both due at the same time, so they would just be submitted.
Are those 2? I saw in the call for involvement you have them, and are those? I'll just copy what you have in there, actually, because that's probably the best way to do it. Because the thing is too, what was this? This was yesterday that you posted this?
Yeah.
So this is directly from the Slack. So the thing, and what's tricky, what I'm still sorting out how to do here, is that these task board chunks of time aren't going to be the same as the outputs, and I'm trying to figure out if they should be or shouldn't be, because the output for this one, if we go here, the output would technically be called this, at least as it stands right now.
Yeah.
So this hasn't yet been made a, just to kind of, I know this will be confusing, but I'm just going to do this. So I'm actually just going to make a brand new thing in outputs.
Okay.
So now this is going to be in lab outputs. I'll put it here too. I forgot what I called it. Key concepts in tech careers. So now this is still the event, just to point out, this is still database events, and this is for the event itself, not necessarily the output. So now it's tagged here.
I see.
We can go back to this
Nice.
task. So this task will be, now I can do it here too. And you don't have to put it there necessarily, but just for the sake of, like this task isn't the same as this. And I feel like I've just made this page so it's totally blank, but you can kind of see, okay, it's related to this event, it's related to these tasks. So this ultimately should be, I think this would be where I want to put the finalized version of it. Like I'll probably just copy, like this is sort of the abstract that I think I submitted.
Yeah.
So, you know,
All right. So yeah, we're coming along on this, so we're coming along on the Alife one. Now the Alife one, I wanted to, if you're interested in, and I'll talk about those in a little bit. I'll just kind of go over what they are again. But if you're interested in collaborating on those, you know, we usually have like, we'll put something in the call for involvement channel, and then if you want to be a part of something, you can, you know, can make a contribution. You can suggest changes, or you can, you know, do something that will, you know, you can. I'm pretty open about authorship. It's usually like if someone wants to participate, they can say, "Hey, I want to be a part of this," and I'll go through the document and maybe suggest some changes, or I can add some things in, and that's how we usually do things. But the one for the open source sustainability for Alife, I want to get the people who were involved last year, last summer. I want to get their input on the document, because I just basically took what they had written up as their final report and modified it, or in the process of modifying it. So it'd be nice if people had thoughts, follow-up thoughts on it. We could put them in there. And then we also need to add it, FQXI competition, which is on here. This is something that's coming up. We often do these. It's an essay contest put on by the FQXI Institute, which is a foundational questions institute. It's like they're like a theoretical physics organization, but they have these essay contests, which are like sort of philosophy of science type essays. And this is not live. I don't think it's live yet. It's going to be live at the end of the month, but
yeah,
it's usually like, you know, they give you a window of time to submit an essay on this topic. And this topic is, how could science be different? So they'll have the details at the end of the month on their website. But for now, let's think, if you want to be involved in that, let's think about this question. And maybe, you know, we could, you know, if you want to propose that we do it a certain way, or if you have an idea about how science could be different, please put that in the Slack or somewhere, or bring it to the meeting. We can talk about it.
Yeah, there's not much of a prompt there yet, so
Yeah.
I would show it, but there's really it just says, oh, starting the 28th, we're accepting submissions until the 19th of April.
Yeah.
So.
And then the one thing you don't have on here is the EI workshop.
Yeah, I was just gonna put that. I was trying to find the dates of like, what is that? But I think it's just like submissions are open basically now.
Yeah. And I don't know if there's a deadline for the submission. I think it's because it's just flash talks, so they're going to add them in. But when you register, they usually have what you want to propose. So we were going to work, Amanda and Jesse and myself, and maybe some other people would work on this cognition futures related submission. And then I am going to submit under my name, and Jesse could submit this under his name. Under my name, I'm going to submit something on this critical periods paper, which is the Alife submission, but to have like, a double dipping submissions because the embodied intelligence is a flash talk. Oh yeah, Amanda, how could science be different? Awesome question. Yeah, let's think about that. Yeah, so this embodied intelligence, I know we wanted to talk a little bit about that today, but I don't know if we have any thoughts about what we want to put in for that submission.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to state due dates or anything. And I actually asked them. I just I did the fanboy approach of hey, great conference. Do you need any help with anything? I'd love to volunteer. And they're like, oh, well, the best you can do is submit and present.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So I'll do that. I can definitely do that. Yeah, it's kind of a small. That's the thing too. I think just to kind of emphasize this for a second. I think this is so to zoom out really big picture. One of the best conferences that I know of that's tailored to things I really want to study and do has only a handful of people that are. I mean, these are invited speakers, and it's not like they're a rinky-dink bunch of nobodies who are, not worth listening to. Not at all. It's much more. It's smaller in its scope and nature, like it has Josh Brungard, who we talk a lot up here about. I think Clark's here again this year, but a lot of folks here that we've sort of referenced and adjacently done stuff with and had a really good conversation. But anyway, I guess my point here is part of the real work in the bigger scope of, I think, some of the aims of cognition features and other things is stepping bravely into a space that's very much in development and doing things in that space that will applying to this is much different than applying to NeuroIPS, obviously. Very, very different. Even if there's actually some more overlap. It's funny because I think there's actually more overlap between NeuroIPS because it is so broad and a little bit more. It is so big now; it's almost too big. But acceptance is very hard there, and even though triple AI, which I was just at, is not really heavily gatekeeping. It's just that conference was so much. There was nothing really about. There were very few cognitive applications to anything. It was mostly just computer vision, biometrics, NLP, and some other very specific. They could be used to some cognitive things, but they are really just tailored on kind of very conventional applications, I suppose. So anyway, let's. Am I still? Oh, we're back to this. All right. Yeah. So this is upcoming until. I don't know. When do you want to say this is basically due, Bradley? The end of the month? Or?
Yeah, let's shoot for the end of the month because that's.
Whoops, that's not right.
Tuesday, 28th.
Weird about this sometimes.
That's April. Yeah.
There we
go. Yeah. That. Okay, that's fine. I think that's
fine. Cool. So, what else? Is there anything else on the docket? Just before we leave the screen and talk about other stuff, because we have NYCWiC, we have Alife, we have admin stuff, and I'm trying to figure out better ways to use emojis or there's some things you can have these be colored and have different you can have different panels on the left side that I'm still sorting out the best way to do. But
is there a way to do subsets the Alife? Could we make two? I don't want to make two bars, but two submissions. Maybe copy it and have different names. I just want to make sure that they're differentiated.
Well, yeah, and that's. I'm trying to. I think that's a question. Would we want to have? Would we want this basically to show the outputs themselves?
Maybe not. Yeah, I think it's fine that way. You're right. It's just maybe make a note in the document.
Yeah. I'm still, and this is a very valid question because it's sort of these, because in one sense, what this could be, this one here could literally just be, it could be this, like it could literally be this thing here, and I'm not sure how to best do that. So that's something I'm still considering how to deal with in Notion, because that is the output, but this period of time working on it, and how do we talk about sort of differentiating the time zone that we are doing these things and the tasks within those time zones versus the output itself, and how do we display that?
Right.
So that's something that is definitely in in discussion. But anything else outside of, I feel like there's a few things that we're probably missing, but that's okay.
I can't think of anything right now. We always have opportunities that arise. So if people have ideas, you can put them in the Slack, or we have like I have a separate spreadsheet, but that's like we can. I think this is better to like keep track of the times, like the dates. But if you have like something you want to submit to, put it in the call for involvement Slack channel, and we can translate it to this or transfer it to this and get the dates are very important because we want to keep track of the dates. So a lot of times we miss things because the dates are we find out about something like 2 days before it's due, or we miss the date, we miss the deadline because it's not in front of us. So you have to be cognizant of the deadlines, and this is just an instructional thing for people when you're doing with these academic deadlines. And GSOC is the same thing. When your proposal period is coming up, and you're gonna have to work on the proposal, and you gotta you're gonna have to turn it in a certain time, but you want to think about it before the deadline. So you want to really plan it out and get everything organized, and it's going to take some time. So you want to always work ahead of the deadline, and this is a good way to visualize it. I can't think of anything else we need to add to this right now, but I know there's probably something.
And that's the thing too. Like, I feel like the ultimate version of this would be like if I put in, you could see a chunk of time from like last Tuesday to the week before, where you saw AAAI event period, like the 2 weeks I was in DC, the week and a half I was in DC on this thing too. And there are reviews that are like calendars, but that would kind of require things to be a little bit different too. I'm not sure, like this isn't really the most useful view right now. There's ways to filter it out, but so it's a little bit of a work in progress that way. But
we might also think about these every time we attend a conference, a lot of times we'll put together like we used to do this with a shared notes document, but I think Jesse's moved a lot of that to the Notion using this. So we have these I know you have the AAAI Notion where you've put a lot of your notes in there. Maybe putting that on here and then like having a follow-up, because I think a lot of these notes documents, they're very rich and they're very detailed, but we don't follow up from them. There's stuff in there that I think we can follow up from. And I don't know how to do that, but I think it's something we can think about. Like if we brought this up, like what are the three things that we could like maybe do to influence our work from this? And I mean, I don't know, like you'd have to think about it, but I mean, like, like some of this stuff, like the the AI ethics work, you're finding a lot of things from these conferences, so that's how we're kind of framing our questions. So that's good. I think having these notes here and just kind of mining these a little bit more is useful.
Yeah. To be continued.
Yeah.
Really.
Well, yeah. Let's move on to.
One last thing I wanted to say. I think Notion is great at being a database. Two things I want to say about it. One, I do want to basically export and back them up on GitHub because we can do that. Like this. Like we can just put it into Markdown. I think it honestly better to do not Markdown or like, I don't know. Export one of them either way and just slap it into, we can break them down, but some of the things like this big database thing here, this is like everything. This is reference materials, this is ideas, this is our notes on everything. So I think this should be backed up on GitHub. Also, like if Notion ever gets weird and like,
yeah,
you know, you gotta have backups and stuff. So I think talking about how to back up Notion on our GitHubs and will be good. Particularly because all of this stuff, like everything in here, nothing in here is personal or particularly sensitive. Like within the database and the homepage, and even this one too. Like this is all open. This is basically open science, open workspace stuff. Secondly, I know we're not using. I just want to address it quickly as I'm sensitive to the fact that Notion probably won't ever really be a really high volume way of engaging the material for people. I think it's great and I'm happy people are wanting to do it, but I've considered like, should we just have a shared Google Drive so people can just drop stuff in like they're normally used to doing, whether it's shared documents or whatever, and sort of kind of what I would like to get almost like a assistant lab manager or someone who wants to be in that role, like someone who just like managing the data of the lab and like making sure the Notion's reflecting the way it should be. Like that's something that we've kind of gone back and forth about different times. But that's
you mean moving things from a more accessible format to something like Notion where we have
right.
Yeah.
Like because I don't want people to feel this. Look, I don't want. We could spend a lot of time on this, but there's a big question in terms of basically administratively speaking. We're dealing with Slack, which has its limitations now for like I think it's 90 days, and it's a little bit. It's a little bit. I feel Slack is a little unwieldy and unclear how to use sometimes in general. We have Notion. We used to have GitHub more active, and you know, I feel like I think there's a place to have a little bit more streamlined whatever it is, with discussion here, Notion here, but also like I don't know if having a shared like a big open shared Google folder we can just drop stuff that we want to put in there may be of use. And I know like another thing too is like I know for a long time there's been this sort of requests about can we have you know can we have the papers, like can we read the papers ahead of the time before like Bradley goes over them in the meetings and stuff like that, and like how do we do that, and you know, so I don't have a great example on hand, but like in our meeting notes, I've tried to have a lot of like I'll try to actually document what happened during the meeting and create functional links to some of the papers we talk about and other things like that. Like there's a lot of interlinking here that's great. So I mean, maybe we can just push people to using Notion and making it more user friendly. But I'm open to suggestions about how to do that. Yeah. I saw him to say something in the chat. So
yeah. So thanks. I think is it Erin joining us?
So.
Yeah. Okay. Well, hello.
Hello.
Yeah. Hi. Nice to see you again. Amanda asked a question here in the chat regarding having things ready for submission deadlines. What I'm trying to do for Bradley's recommendation is to build notes that are a couple of days work away from being a submittable abstract. Yes, that's definitely a good idea because if you have a tight deadline, you can turn it around So when we
That's
just
like the art of the real research deadline and project management in the real world. Is
yeah.
that. That's exactly it.
So when we discover something a few days before a deadline, we're ready to be adapted for that setting. Yeah, like I said, you're going to be doing your work. Your work is going to be basically your work, and then you have different audiences you want to pitch it to. So this critical periods paper that I'm working on with Alife, and if you want to be a part of that, that's great. That's going to be adapted to EI workshop, maybe a little bit different language for the abstract, the presentation. Multiple venues. They're going to be interested in different things at the EI workshop, so you stress those things. You just change it a little bit, but you have the base there, so it's ready to go. Now I'm gonna go over some of the papers I talked about.
Yeah.
And these are the ones that I put in the call for involvement. So this is the open source community sustainability using agent-based models paper. This is our 3 Google Summer Code Scholars from last year, plus Jesse and myself. This is the abstract here. We built these models. We use this adversarial approach to the problem where we had, like an active inference version of this tool. We had a reinforcement learning part of this tool, and then we had a personality theory aspect. And I'm putting these together in a way that's sort of fluid. It just kind of argues that there are 3 different approaches to this problem, and kind of going over those things. And then the models themselves, I need to update some of this. This is where I would like Brian Himanshu and Hussein's input on this, because I just took from their write-ups what they had put in their write-ups, but there's probably more to say here, and we might be missing out on some things here. But I think basically I think it's even between the different projects, so that's good. And then there's some discussion at the end, a little bit of discussion about the Evergood regulator theorem, and I'll probably add something on the ethical regulator, which I didn't do here. Well, I did, okay, but maybe a little bit more on that. And then the auditing tool, which is sort of in a state of we're trying to get it up and running. So I'd like to advertise it here at least. And then that's the references. That's for this workshop that they're having in agent-based modeling. This is going to be submitted to the main track. This is critical periods. And what we've been doing with developmental neurosimulation, which is this approach where we're building agents, embodied agents, and we're using those to sort of simulate development and brains in development and behavior in development. So this is building on this approach. This is from the stuff that we've done with Bradenberg vehicles, and then the stuff that we've done with some of the other agent-based stuff, agent-based papers that we've written, like the past EI workshop papers, the MetaBrains, all of that is in that sort of bin. So this is basically going through some of this. And then, basically framing critical periods as essential to learning and development. So an agent is sort of this ball of pixels, or, you could say it's a ball of cells, but it's an in silico model. So it's a ball of pixels. And then it's differentiating into this body, and it's differentiating into behavior. So there are actually 2 types of acquisition. You have morphogenetic acquisition, which is the acquisition of a body, and then behavioral acquisition, which is the acquisition of behaviors. And so the idea is that critical periods are the time when acquisition is enhanced. So for this purposes of this, you have like a stable period of development or a stable life history trajectory, and then you have these windows that open up, and it opens up this acquisition. And so you can either acquire a morphology or you can acquire behaviors. So this becomes important in that you have, like if you have a process, like say, focusing your vision on like certain places, you think about like a visual system, You might have a bunch of sensors and they're all kind of doing their own thing. How do they become entrained on different things in a animal? They usually have an intentional focus in a visual system. Their visual system is tuned to different frequencies of light, these sorts of things. How do those come to be? And then the answer, of course, in the literature is that critical periods are times when those are tuned. And so we can have these critical period windows that overlap or that are spaced out in time. And the idea here is that you're acquiring the morphology for this, you're acquiring eyes or light sensors, you're acquiring the behavioral aspects of tuning this system, and then you're acquiring the sort of the connectome or the connectome aspects of it, which is like the processing, the downstream processing. So all of those things are different types of acquisition, and they're spaced out in time. Maybe they're overlapping, maybe they're in sequence. And the idea here is that we kind of model the critical periods first of all, and we model this as a problem of opening up critical periods as an innate process, that it's like there's this encoding that enables plasticity in the phenotype, and then there's this environmental information that shapes what's going on with that plasticity, that plastic response, and there's this rate of acquisition that we end up with that determines what the critical period looks like. And so this is a lot of mathematical modeling. There's a model of the connectome that we've worked on in a number of papers. And then the results are just basically walking through some of these things, how they look, in different scenarios. There's some we call pseudo data, which is where you build an example of what the data should look like. This is something theory building that people do a lot. This is a very noisy critical period window, and the idea is that you gain, after the critical period window closes, there's an increase in information in the agent. So, there's this learning process that basically happens, and the response, the acquisition rate goes down after the critical period, but it's elevated information that you have, or a rate of acquisition that's elevated relative to what happened before. And then critically, there are these contingencies that happen. So, you have to acquire light sensors or eyes before you can tune that system of visual sensors. So you can't tune those sensors before they're there, and then you can't have your connectome tuned before those sensors are tuned. So you can't have the downstream effects without the upstream effects being in place. And so there's this contingency analysis we can do that puts this all into a network. And I'm not done talking about that yet, as kind of hoping for people's feedback on that. And then a discussion about some of these things about noise and environmental structure and things like that. And so this is really following up on a lot of the work we've been doing with agents and with some of these other papers that we referenced that we've been doing work on. So I wanted to get people's feedback on that. It's in the Slack channel again, call for involvement. Yeah. Okay, any questions about that? I'm just going to move on to some features here. So let's see. We had a couple of things I came up with. I thought they were really interesting. In the Cognition Futures group, we talked about the decade of the brain. It came up in last week's discussion. And this was in the 1990s. There was this thing called the Decade of the Brain. And the NIH, it was an initiative by the NIH, is basically at the sort of the dawn of fMRI as a science. They started to, image brains and get really high quality images. And then, this is the time when they started to write papers on, if we put someone in a scanner and give them a task, what does it look like? What kind of parts of the brain would they call light up? And so they, the very early fMRI papers are really just parts lists. What lights up, what areas of the brain. We can localize these activity areas of the brain. It's actually an indirect measure of activity, but you can see that there are these fMRI images. So, and, it was really cool, but that was the early days. And so since then, we've moved on to like networks and looking at other types of ways of doing neuroimaging. But this was the sort of the impetus for the Decade of the Brain. And there's, this interest it was started by George H.W. Bush as an initiative to drive brain research, and it continued through the 90s. And so this is one of the things that, this article is a reflection on all of this. Like, what have we learned since the decade of the brain? So it may seem a little quaint now that the decade of the brain happened in the 90s, when we maybe knew a lot less about the brain than we do now. But so this is one perspective. Nora Volkow, she's from the National Institute on Drug Abuse. So the NIH is divided into different institutes, and they're all sort of under this umbrella. This is the Institute on Drug Abuse. Neuroscience is at a historic turning point. A full decade after the decade of the brain, this article was, I think, written in 2011. A continuous stream of advances is shattering long-held notions about how the human brain works and what happens when it doesn't. These advances are also reshaping the landscapes of other fields, from psychology to economics, education, and the law. And so until the decade of the brain, people believed that once development was over, the adult brain underwent very few changes. So this was like, this had a lot, this shaped our perspective on like nature versus nurture and some of these other issues. And, whether our behavior is controlled by genetics or by environment or by both. And so we've kind of untangled that a bit since then. And plasticity has played a role in that. So, we know now that like even when you have a mature brain, it's actually plastic, and that it's highly responsive to environmental stimuli, and the connections between neurons are dynamic and can rapidly change within minutes of stimulation. So we have a lot of that information, and that's actually something from the molecular revolution, which happened in parallel with the fMRI revolution. We started to get tools, and especially in the last 20 years, we've gotten very good high-resolution tools to let us look at molecular changes within a brain. In animal models, we've been able to figure out sort of how memories are encoded and how some of these neurochemical changes happen, figuring out the timescales of those things and so forth. So this is one perspective on this, really kind of highlighting neuroplasticity and some of the advances we made in that. There are also some connections to brain-computer interfaces, which are helpful in regaining functional, like for people who've lost movement control or lost vision, we have interfaces that now we can restore some of that, at least in clinical populations. And, we have very early prototypes of that, but those things are possible. So Thomas Insel, which we talked about in the Cognition Futures, his name came up. So he talks about when the decade of the brain began in 1990, scientists had developed both drug and behavioral treatments for most mental disorders, but their understanding of these disorders were primitive. 2 decades later, neuroscientists are finally uncovering the brain processes involved in mental disorders. And so this has great promise. And, this is, again, we've talked about, psychotherapy and other things where, or in psychiatry, where we want to define some of the behaviors, we want to define what's going on in the brain. So this is very relevant to that. And then he talks about circuit disorders and how this is one way to think about like mental disorders. Can we modify a circuit through drugs, drug interventions, or other types of interventions? There are things like transcranial magnetic stimulation, which will shut down some parts of the circuit temporarily. That's used in some therapy settings, so therapeutic settings. So this is actually something that we can do without cutting open the brain and putting in an implant. There's still ways we can intervene with drugs and things like that, but thinking about it as a circuit disorder is an interesting way to think about it. But this is something that came out of this decade of the brain. Then there's basic science and gene findings. As I said, there was a molecular revolution in the 90s and 2000s, and this is kind of yielding fruit now. So this is something we can use to address things like, mental disorders, degenerative diseases, and the like. And then, of course, there's alcoholism, we're kind of getting, demystifying the mechanisms there. We can look at visual neuroscience and see some of how these technologies are able to help, restore visual circuits. And yeah, I'll put this in the Slack. There's a lot more here. I don't want to spend too much time because we have limited time. So then there's this other thing that I found: the origin of demo or die and retrospection by a sprint review. This is actually relevant to project management, and I'll probably cover this maybe in one of the lectures on project management. But this is Jesse's favorite term, demo or die, which is basically living on, like, you want to prove something, you have a proof of concept ready to go. And if the proof of concept isn't there, then that's not really something to worry about.
It's my favorite term in the sense that a favorite term can be something that you aspire to and do not live up to as much as you want to.
That's
So
fine.
we can all have favorite terms that fit in that category. Just to point it out.
So this is something from the Agile method of project management and project development. So this is something that has been around in technology. So as a result of demo or die, this idea of Scrum, this type of management called Scrum, went on to encapsulate the idea that it's imperative as part of a best practices process to include a demonstration phase prior to a rollout. And so this is basically showing the proof of concept, making sure it works. Now in our lab, we do more academic stuff as well. So, demo or die for us in the academic sense is, will your idea translate into some artifact, like a paper or a poster or whatever? And in that sense, we kind of live up to it, but it's, again, it's like one of those things where I think it's an important part of like developing your ideas that you have something that you can actually put into practice. And so that's where I think a lot of this comes from. And they had an interview with Jeff Sutherland, who was one of the founders of this idea. And so this is a historical point, but if you want, I'll put this again in the Slack. We can go through. They would do things like say, "Why are you building it this way? Haven't you looked at what Microsoft or Borland is doing to that? The way you built that really sucks." So this is one of the reasons why demo or die. I mean, you can do that to show kind of like that your idea is on par with maybe some of the other ideas out there that are similar. But it's also, it can be somewhat of a, like, people see it and then they say, so what? So it's like, maybe there's more to demo or die than just simply the demoing part. Maybe there's, but we, I think we should bring that up. I think that this article is a nice background for some of this.
I think one of the overlooked things about demo or die is that what really makes it is the community itself. Like, the more you demo and the more you get used to doing it, the more people, that whole community is going to be like, oh, well, actually, you can be, a jerk about it or not. But you can be like, oh, well, did you know that this other group is doing this? Because I just saw something yesterday that said X, Y, Z. And I feel like that's, I think sometimes the evidence on demo or die is like, well, you better have your, however phrase you want to say, let's better have your ducks in a row.
Yeah.
Otherwise, there's a way that can be approached where it's kind of pressuring towards just get the MVP, the minimum viable product, or minimum viable demo, or whatever you want to say. Just get it out. And there's something to that. Like, sometimes you have to do that. But I think to tie back into what I was saying at the start of this meeting about a lot of sorry, I don't know if is it really noisy in the background? I'm sorry if it is. What's that?
No.
Okay, great, awesome. These are excellent noise canceling happening right now. What I was saying at the start of the meeting was basically like, I think one of the hardest things to do well is have deep diving research where you have to get technically deep into weeds and to really do the full stack justice of, okay, well, how can I explain the relevance of this to a general population or to people who are handing out money to do research or whatever it is? how do you justify it? And it's such a tough act because there's a lot of weird incentives to doing that different ways. But to make this somewhat, to try to truncate and abridge my conversation about this, there's an element of like, the more you can have proper familiarity, consistent, engaging, positive environment familiarity discussion, where you're used to talking about things in those terms, in terms of what's happening and getting feedback, and you can say criticism or perspective or whatever about the work you're doing. I think that's like really invaluable, and it's something we do talk about here or do, but I think I do want to continue to try to be like really normalizing the discussion and the community feedback aspect, because I think that's sort of the key. Them that I think isn't just having something you can show, it's getting the feedback itself and having people who want to give the feedback, particularly in a good way or a constructive way. So yeah, the end.
Right. Yeah, that's great. I'm just making notes here. Yeah, we're always looking for better ways to give feedback. I think sometimes people kind of are intimidated by feedback, or they say, "Yeah, it's fine." I mean, really, I think there's a fine line between like being hypercritical and being like productively critical, and so that's something we need to make sure doesn't happen.
And so much of that, I know we're kind of over time and we've extended this conversation a lot. A lot of that's about culture, as in like the norms you're having in the group or community, but also like I've had conversations with someone who may join the lab or participate in our project soon, who's into public health and focus on basically DEI or diversity, equity, inclusion. Excuse me. And just sort of how like the framing, like the art of having those discussions, I think is really important. And I'm very like in this lab we're super open about that, because I've been in many lab environments or research or academic environments where it's like you show up, the norms are unsaid, expectations aren't really made clear, and the way discussion is done is sort of like, well, if you step out of bounds, the only way you find out is if you step out of landmine. Yeah. And it's like that really turns a lot of people off or makes discussion constrained in ways that it doesn't necessarily need to be. So I think maybe something we can do, Bradley, I would actually be up for this, as part of the project management course if you want, or just something from the lab, is like write some opinion piece on demo or die, plus like the other side of the coin, or something where it's like the community feedback aspect, both in sort of setting the stage for discussion, and then also like soliciting feedback. And this is super relevant also to things that are going on in plot twisters, because a big thing we're concerned about there, even internally, is like demoing ideas for how to do some of the work we want to do and getting feedback that way. Yeah. So like I think that's a huge, very applicable thing to talk about, and fits under our major banner of education and I forget what else, open science,
open source,
from our beautiful lab map. But I like to follow up on that in particular.
Okay. Yeah, great. So now I'm going to go back to let's see. I had a couple of things here to finish up. I'm going to talk about this little feature, and then I'm going to talk about a paper. So this was a discussion on ChatGPT and it being a version. I don't know if I can do that. Okay, that's not what I want. But it's an article on. I don't think the article is going to open, but this was an essay by Ted Chiang on ChatGPT. It's about being a blurry JPEG of the web. And it's basically how ChatGPT is a large language model that samples data from the web. They scrape the web for data, training data, and then it generates information that when you query it, it gives an answer. And so the answer then is often, it can be wrong or it can be distorted. It depends on the prompt, right? So we've been through this, the ethics of like, maybe it generates misinformation, or maybe it generates like the wrong answers for things, but maybe it generates the right answers. One way to look at that is it's very problematic, which can be. Some people are tolerant of that, some people aren't. But the other way to look at it is as a problem of compression and information theory, and how it's sort of a blurry version. Like if you look at a JPEG, has like a structure. If I give you a high quality picture in JPEG format, there's some compression, but it doesn't affect the quality of the image. It's called lossless compression. There's another type of compression called lossy compression, where you just compress something, an image, and it it looks like this. So this is supposed to be a smiley face, and now it's like distorted. You can still see the smiley face, but you can't see the details. And so the argument in this article, which I can't bring up right now, is that ChatGPT is a sort of lossless or lossy compression of the web, or by extension, reality. So if you ask it a question, it may or may not reflect reality, and this is a product of the compression that the compression algorithm, or that it's sampled incomplete information about the world. It sampled incomplete information about the web, and it's just putting together what it knows. So Maxim Roginski, who's actually a professor at Illinois in the coordinated science lab, he does a lot of stuff with information theory and compression. He has some interesting takes on AI. He's not really an AI researcher per se, but he understands like the math behind a lot of like information theory. So he actually had some interesting things to say about this article. He said the key metaphor in this piece is that a blurry JPEG is that of a blurry JPEG. Large language models can be thought of as lossy compressors for text, just as JPEG is a lossy compressor for images. JPEG is lossy technically, but it's not where you can see it. There are some aspects of JPEG where you get noise in the image, but the adjective blurry is important, but for subtle reasons which Chiang's piece does not convey. So this is blurriness is just kind of like this lossy compression where you lose parts of the image because you're compressing it. To understand this, we need to get into some very basic theory of data compression. So you'll need to bear with me. And he runs through the mathematics of this. We have a random object X taking values in some source alphabet S, which is like the language of reality or of the full web. The compressed version Y will take values in some reproduction alphabet R. So that's like taking, the compressed version will be taking, it reproduces the source alphabet, but it's, not the entire thing. It's like a subset of that. The compression procedure is a composition of two functions, an encoder from F to S, say, the set B of all binary strings, and an decoder G from B to R. So this is the compression work. The compression is lossy if F is not a one-to-one map, which is the important point here. That if it's not a one-to-one map between the representation and reality, that's lossy. And so this is ChatGPT is giving us a representation of the world, and it's lossy because it's losing resolution. And there's not a one-to-one mapping in that function between the real world and the model. And so this is, I think, really kind of an interesting take, because it does point out that there's this formalization we can make to prove how much these models will sort of represent the real world as is, or if it's representing some other type of world that, because when you imagine if you just kind of like, when you were a kid and you went out into the world and you thought about, you didn't know everything about every context, and you walked into an unfamiliar context, you would kind of invent facts about the world. Like, they always have like these things with kids, and they say, where do babies come from? And they haven't been taught about sex, sexual reproduction. And so they make up some wild story. That's kind of what ChatGPT is doing. And this is kind of why, because it has this representation of the world that's lossy and incomplete. So this is the blur that ChatGPT induces. It's a probabilistic generative model built from a lossy compressor whose reproduction alphabet consists of probability distributions over a set of tokens. But this is not the same as blurry JPEG. It's fundamentally different. So it's kind of an interesting take on this. Yeah, so I mean, I'm gonna move into this paper, but we can put questions in the chat if you want to in the Slack. I think that's an interesting thing to follow up on, though, especially for some of the stuff we're doing for New York Celebration of Women in Computing. I may, in fact, talk about that in my part of the thing. So just a heads up on that. That's an interesting debate. The other paper I wanted to talk about is this Dendrocentric learning. And this is a paper that came out, it's called the Dendrify paper. And people have been exploring this area of computing. So we think about neural networks. They're these cells that have connections, and they're organized in layers. So it's like the brain, focusing on the neurons. We don't really focus on the neurotransmitters or the connections. The connections are basically statistical weights. That's the typical neural network. In dendritic computing, it's a bit different. It's where you have these dendrites that are connections. You have a lot of connections from neuron to neuron, and those connections have different possibilities. They have different weights, and they get summed up and into a summarizer, and that's the thing that goes to the downstream neuron. And so this is the way this style of computing is actually very fuzzy, and it's very different from like your typical neural network because it has a lot of different potential weights that come together and get summed together in different ways. So this is a dendritic computing. It has a history of about 30 years, but this is the Dendrify paper where they're doing this work with. If you work with SNNs and are looking for some bio-inspiration, this third might be for you. SNNs being spiking neural networks. So I think this is the Dendrify framework in Nature Communications by these authors, incorporating dendrites to spiking neural networks. So the abstract reads, computational modeling is indispensable for understanding how subcellular neuronal features influence circuit processing. So subcellular neuronal features are these dendrites that bring information into the neuron from many different places, many different sources, and then get summed into this single neuron that then has an output. However, the role of dendritic computations in network level operations remains largely unexplored. So it's partly because existing tools do not allow the development of realistic and efficient network models that account for dendrites. Current spiking neural networks, although efficient, are usually quite simplistic, overlooking essential dendritic properties. Conversely, circuit models with morphologically detailed neuron models are computationally costly, thus impractical for large network simulation. So circuit models are hard to model. It's just too expensive. Spiking neural networks, which just show like a spike output of a neuron, are very simplistic and they don't give you the dendritic information. So to bridge the gap between these two extremes, we introduced Dendrify, which allows you to put dendritic features in the spiking neural network model. This is an open source Python package based on Brian 2. So Brian is a project, actually, they have GSOC projects sponsored by INCF. If you check those out, they're part of, you go on to the INCF discourse for GSOC, and they may have some projects if you're interested. I'm not associated with Brian, I just happen to know that. Dendrify, through simple commands, automatically generates reduced compartmental neuron models with simplified yet biologically relevant dendritic and synaptic integrative properties. Such models strike a good balance between flexibility, performance, and biological accuracy. So they have this model of, they show how Dendrify brings together the benefits of detailed biophysical models with reduced integrate and fire models. Integrate and fire models being the spiking neural networks, integrating information and then having either the neuron fires or it doesn't. So it kind of merges the two types of models, and it really kind of highlights the benefits of both. This is, a spiking neural network comprising of active dendritic mechanisms, which come from this microcircuit of detailed biophysical neurons. So you have these biophysical neurons, they have detail, they have axons and dendrites and signals that come in that way, and then they have a cell body, and then they have axons that go out to a synaptic cleft, which then fire, when the neuron fires, it transfers information, neurochemicals to the downstream neuron. And so this is a biophysical neuron. It's much more detailed than your average neural network. It's not just a black box. It's actually showing you some of the details of a neuron and giving you these spikes as a result for different different ion channels being activated. So you have specificity for calcium ion channels, potassium ion channels, sodium ion channels, and the like, and NMDA spikes, things like that. So this is a model here, the apical dendrite. This is NMDA and AMPA inputs. This is the soma, and this is the basal dendrite. So this is where the signals are, specific types of signals are coming in for specific types of neurotransmitter. They're coming into the neuron, they're getting summed here, and then there's an output. So, these different inputs contribute to whether the neuron will spike or not. And you can really tune the neuron in very specific ways. And so the network gets tuned in very specific ways. And so then this shows more about the dendrites and the detail here. You have, a distance from the cell body, and that makes a difference as how these signals are summed together. So you have AMPA and NMDA inputting at the distal end, and then the same inputting at the proximal end, and it affects the trace that gets produced here. So this is the firing trace here, and it shows that there are differences. So this is a reduced compartmental model. Compartmental model just means you're using these different compartments. So you have these different compartments that contain elements, and you're putting them together. It's like kind of a modular thing, and it's operating as a single model. So this is the detail on that. Then they have more examples of this. These replicate real parts of the brain, so you can actually model different parts of the brain with this. And so this is a nice paper. I think it goes over a lot of the technical details. But then there's this other review by Kwabena Boha, and he works on biologically inspired neural systems. He's worked on a lot of dendritic computing and different things like that. So he's done a lot of work on this. He wrote an article or a review perspective article. I think this is Nature. Yeah. From late last year on Dendrocentric learning for synthetic intelligence. So this is a nice review of some of these techniques and how they can be used in intelligent systems in an AI. It talks about how artificial intelligence is requiring a lot of computational power and how that's scaling ever upward. And so, how do we make the computations efficient relative to the hardware? And so he talks about some of the challenges and some of the ways that bioinspiration can help. So he proposes to transcend this three-dimensional thermal constraint, which is the constraint of chips and like all of these information demands that very large neural networks are making of them, by moving away from learning with synapses to learning with dendrites. So synaptic inputs are not weighted precisely, but rather ordered meticulously along a short stretch of dendrite, termed dendrocentric learning. So the synapses are the connections at the end of the neuron, and that's how we kind of think about like neural networks as synaptic connections, and we take the statistical weights. What this whole school of dendrocentric learning is arguing is that you need to have these kind of tree representations instead of these nondescript connections. And so this will help with computational power. It'll help with different other types of representational problems that we have with the physiology and translating physiologically inspired or physiologically detailed models to a large scale neural network. So this is talks about power consumption in the models. So it's very hardware oriented, but it's definitely worth kind of following up on from the first article. So that was a very short overview. I didn't want to I didn't have time to go really deeply into the papers, but I think it's worth going over, and I'll put those in the Slack for people to
read on. Put them in the Slack because I'm trying to do a better job of taking notes.
Yeah.
And I put a lot of these things in the Notion page now, and I thank you, Vrushali, for you asked for access, and you should have it now. So Yeah, anybody who wants to contribute to the notes document or add notes or thoughts to the Notion document, please do that now or even going back. And if you want to add stuff and so on. So yeah, great.
So did we have anything else we wanted to talk about before we end today, or any comments?
I think that's that. There are a few questions in the chat.
Yeah, well, we had, let's see, we had Screen, which I take as Jesse.
Yes.
Brian definitely is a project, just kidding. I'd rather not be associated with Brian either. I think it's actually a reference to like Monty Python, but I don't know. Like that's
yes.
Yeah.
But there's a certain way of saying things. So you were saying, oh, Brian is a project, and then something about I'm not really associated with it. And so I just had to say,
oh well, I mean
Brian.
I'm not part of that project, yeah.
I know. I'm grossly misrepresenting Bradley for my self-indulgent humor, and I will tell Brian about that. So don't.
Oh yeah, we have a
I'm
Brian
just being
here,
fine.
yeah.
I'm being
Yeah.
a troll. Basically. So anyway,
so Amanda thought it was very neat. Thank you. So thank you, Amanda. Oh, the thing I was presenting on. So
yeah, no, that's really good. I want to learn more about dendritic computing myself, and that may be a useful method to look at for some of the. I don't know if we can do much for the cognitive science method project, but like methods in general are always something you should be aware of, and I want to do more into that. When I didn't get the first article, but I got the second article of the Dendrocentric learning cycle, and also I think Mac, if you can share Maxon's the
tweets and the
yeah, for next week, all I'll say for next week is I want to continue to flesh out more on the administration stuff, and I'm going to be talking more directly about New York Celebration of Women in Computing. So I don't think anybody here is on that, but if Aiden's watching or Ankit, we'll be talking a little more about that. And even Bradley mentioned like something you might say at that event. So we'll probably I might set up like a specific meeting time to do that, or just put more updates in the chat and kind of say, hey, here's where we're at, and break it down a bit more. So more focus for next week: New York Celebration of Women Computing and lab admin stuff, and some finishing futures things too. So that's my outlook.
All right, thank you. Yeah. Erin, did you have anything? Amanda, Raj? Okay. No? All right. Well, thank you for attending. It was another great meeting. See you around in Slack and talk to you next week.
All right. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Bye. See you soon.
See you soon. Bye.